Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It is Dr. DeShavo, and I am retaping this fever and pyrexia because the visual quality of the previous one is not too great. So if you watched the previous one, you're all set. I'm going to try to keep it as close as possible. And if you like, you can watch the new one. Both works for me. So we are starting this short little lecture on fever, also known as pyrexia. And I have a video, which I'm not going to play. You can pull up the PowerPoint yourself. And if you maximize them and then click on this link, it'll take you to the brain parts of the song. Why I put that in there is because we have not gone over central nervous system yet. And it's important to know the general gist of the brain. So if you don't remember this, you can pull up a little picture after I explain this to you, or while you're sitting next to your computer, grab your phone, get a picture of the brain up. And what I want you to mostly remember is where the hypo, we all know hypo means below, thalamus is. And the hypothalamus is a small area, but very, very important, that is just below the thalamus, and it helps to regulate temperature, among many other things. Okay, so if you do not remember that, go look at a picture of where the hypothalamus is, just to give yourself an idea of where it is in the brain. And once again, it's below the thalamus. You may not remember even what the thalamus is. That's a huge regulator of sensory input for the brain as well. And the hypothalamus is not this big area that you're like, oh, that's the hypothalamus. Much like, looking at the cerebellum. It's not that obvious. But it's deep in the brain. It's well protected and hidden in the center of the brain. I do think it would be a good idea for you to review that and the general brain parts. Fetal circulation rap for YouTube, I just found, and it was hysterical. You will not be tested on it. We will go over general fetal circulation when we go over cardiovascular. It's just cute. So if you have a few minutes, you can watch that. If you don't want to laugh or chuckle, you don't have to watch it either. That's fine. Okay, so normal thermo temperature regulation, how we regulate that temperature. We all know 98.6 degrees. And there's a 1 degree variance. Just from experience, there's more variance than that. I always run at like 97, So for me, if I'm at 99, I've got like a 2 degree temperature. So that varies a little bit, as I'm sure all of you know from previous experience. Rectal is most accurate regarding core temperature. That's why pediatricians prefer it. But man, the temperatures that we take now are just so much more sensitive than they used to be, that I think usually if you're taking it with a good thermometer, you're getting a good reading. Why is the temperature lowest in the morning? Can you think of why? It's because our metabolism is lowest in the morning. Our metabolism will release substances which will increase the amount of oxygen and glucose that we're using to create more energy. And in the morning, it's going to be lower because we don't have as many of those substances getting our body going, which means we're not as active. We aren't moving our muscles as much, which is another reason why our temperature is lowest in the morning. We're not moving as much. Okay. And then as we get up and get moving, our metabolism gets going towards the end of the day, and our temperature rises. Now, if we're talking about abnormal high versus low temperatures rather than that normal variant in temperature throughout the day, at high temperatures, people can die because that's called hypothermia. We're going to walk our way through that. If we think about it, enzymes that help facilitate all of our physiological processes in the body can be denatured or broken down. And if we break down those enzymes, we don't have normal physiological functions because we've destroyed those enzymes, and we can actually die at really high temperatures. Okay. And for children, those high temperatures will be lower than an adult. I'll go through those numbers in a few slides. Now, really low temperatures are a problem too, hypothermia. People can die with hypothermia because our physiological processes get so slow that we don't have enough warmth or physiological processes to keep our body viable and alive. Now, cells produce heat as a byproduct of their metabolic activities. Skeletal muscle is a huge one, okay? A little bit liver, a little bit heart, but skeletal muscles are going to produce 3/4 or 75% of the heat that we have in our body. And that's why if we are standing at our baseball game, much like I was 3 weeks ago, and it was still cold in May in upstate New York, I was freezing. So, of course, rather than sitting, I get up and I start moving around, try to move my skeletal muscles to create that heat. Okay. Now, heat loss is by the surface of the skin, but how does this happen? So if I were to give you a brief review of the skin and its layers, there's 3 layers. The top layer is made up of compressed cells layered on top of each other. So that way we have a layer of protection. If I were to actually scratch the top of my skin, cells would come off. Did you know that those cells actually create the dust in your house? Gross, right? Anyway, but we have multiple cell layers on top of the skin simply as protection. If we were to pull that back, underneath it is a layer called the dermis. And that dermis has a lot of collagen fibers. To create a thicker layer of protection. It's more of a physical layer, protective layer. And the top layer is protected because of the layer cells. This is more durable, is the word I'm looking for. There's thicker collagen fibers in the dermis. And interspersed throughout that collagen fibers, or those collagen fibers in the dermis, we have blood vessels. And those blood vessels are regulated, either opened up or closed down depending on how cold or hot we are. So if we're really, really warm and we send, blood to the skin, we think we've learned that in the past, it goes to the dermis, that middle layer of collagen fibers, and that is where that heat is released from the surface of the skin. The third layer, just to be complete, is the hypodermis, which has fat. Just so as you know, okay? Dangerously high temperature in children. So if your child is less than 3 months, contact his daughter immediately if he is rectal of 104 or higher, okay? And then it walks through the other dangerous levels, as you know. And with children, of course, we spoke about the enzymes being destroyed, and if those enzymes are destroyed in children, they can't keep their normal physiological functions. And the problem with children is it's much lower than adults. Adults can go up to about 105. In children, we can only go up to, you can see, about 100 to 103. So, as my friend said, I brought my one son in once with the temperature because I always thought that you guys needed to know. I didn't know the temperature of them while they're sick. She's like, you can always give them Tylenol. Okay, so words of wisdom. For adults, don't treat fevers below 102 because, really, guys, there's a reason for fever. The fever is there to try to sort of bake out the infection. We're going to go through those physiological steps in just a few slides. So you want to wait until you go to 102 or higher to do either Tylenol, ibuprofen, or aspirin in an adult. And we don't want to use aspirin in children under the age of 19 because it can trigger Ray's syndrome, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. You're not supposed to give children under 6 months of age ibuprofen as well. Shivering, we shiver because it actually will contract and release the skeletal muscles, which will create more warmth. And this happens automatically and is triggered by that hypothalamus to shiver to create more heat. Or if you're standing out in May at your son's baseball game, freezing, your brain goes, time to get up and move around so you can create more body heat. Mechanisms of heat loss. Now we have radiation, evaporation, and conduction and convection. And I've got a great picture, which I actually inserted, which wasn't on the last one. Radiation is literally just the release of heat. Evaporation is when the sweat on the skin or the air from the lungs comes out. And what happens with evaporation is, in order to release the water to the air, that water needs to draw heat from the body to break it apart into the hydrogen and the oxygen particles or atoms. So the heat from the body is what breaks apart those molecules to release them into the air. That's how evaporation or sweat cools the body. Now, conduction versus convection. Let's look at this picture. This really helped. Evaporation, loss of heat by evaporation. Water radiation just goes into the air. Conduction, you can see, is direct transfer by conduct. And I love this picture because I think, pictures are worth a million words. And I had trouble remembering conduction versus convection. So if you sit down on the cold rock, you're going to directly transfer your heat to that rock, versus convection. Or you can also remember it by a convection oven, which moves air through the oven to evenly bake things. But convection is moving air to remove heat that way. Regulation of heat loss. We increase our metabolism. We'll use more energy if we want to increase our warmth. Our body tells us, our brain tells us, put on some clothes, right? To help maintain that heat close to our body so we don't lose it. The dermis can open up blood vessels to superficially warm the skin. Now, cool the skin, okay? You can also take clothes off if you're too warm, okay? Sweat production. So we can lose that water from the skin or from the lungs, and you can also lose water through urination, defecation, but I'm talking about the regulation of heat loss. So sweat from the skin will need to be broken apart by the heat of the body in order to be released, and that'll also release that energy transfer of heat from the body into the air. And that's how we lose heat, by sweating when we're really warm. Now, regulation of body temperature, just in general, we have receptors in the periphery of the body that tells us how hot or cold we are. Okay, they're called thermoreceptors. Those thermoreceptors go up into the regulation center, which is in that hypothalamus below the thalamus, and then we will have a response. Skeletal muscles will shiver, or our brain will tell our skeletal muscles to move. Sweat glands will release sweat to cool our skin. The dermis, the blood vessels in the dermis can open up, bring more blood to the surface of the skin, thereby releasing heat to the air to either, through that convection, radiation, or through evaporation in behavioral responses, either controlled or not controlled. Putting on or taking off clothes, shivering or not shivering, is going to be involuntary. Heat stroke, so too much thermia, heat stroke. Combination of heat and high humidity, which prevents sweating, and lack of water, shade, and rest, can cause heat stroke. People taking diuretics and with heart problems are more prone to it. It also is way more stressful on the heart, and I'll show you why in a few slides. Okay, so heat exhaustion is going to be that mild form of heat stroke. In heat stroke, you're going to have that treated if it gets too progressed. So dehydration leads to what's called anhydrosis, which is the inability to sweat, which is when somebody has really moved into a progressive form of heat stroke. That's bad news. If you have somebody who's showing signs of heat stroke and they're not sweating, as you all probably already know, that's really bad combination. Exertional heat stroke is seen with extreme activity, cannot clear the heat from the body. Okay. Malignant hyperthermia of anesthesia is a post-anesthesia effect. I've never had that, but I know after having surgery and having anesthesia, I remember being hot and cold. I think it affects the same brainstem, and I'm making this up as I go, but this is probably a pretty educated guess. Anesthesia is going to affect the same areas of the brainstem as the hypothalamus that same general area. So I think it takes a while for your body to regulate those areas and get it more stabilized again. Okay. Signs and symptoms: dry, hot skin with classic heat stroke, clammy and sweaty with exertional heat stroke, temperature of 105 or above, confusion or delirium because your body, once again, likes to be in that moderate temperature. If you're getting way too high, you're going to damage those enzymes. You cannot create the same physiological procedures as we have in the past. Now, tachycardia. Don't forget that as you increase temperature, body will increase metabolism. As we increase metabolism, we increase usage of oxygen and glucose. If we increase the use of oxygen and glucose, your heart is going to beat more, so we could get more oxygen and glucose out to the tissues of the body, which causes a lot of stress in the heart. Hypothermia, core temperature below 95. Mild causes shivering, behaviors to get warm, putting on more clothes. Below 90, you begin to act irrationally. Physiological mechanisms slow down. Enzymes don't work as well. We don't create the same physiological effects as we would when we are warmer. We're really delicate creatures. We like to be right in that midline. Heat loss in water is 30 times quicker than air, which amazes me. That's why I suppose they want you to not get cold and wet, much like the polar bear dive or dip or whatever it is that they do. Always blows my mind. I look at people doing that and I think, oh my gosh, I hope somebody doesn't die because they put so much stress on their body and their heart. Below 86 degrees, cerebral blood flow and oxygen needs decrease, and that's why people who get really cold sometimes end up okay, because the needs for oxygen to the brain will decrease. It doesn't need as much, blood flow is slower, and you slow those physiological processes. Treatment is to slowly rewarm, to inhale warm humidified air. I think this is all common sense. But after drop is an effect in which the lowering of body temperature of a patient causes the extremities to get really cold as well. So as we start to warm the central core, the peripheral cold blood and the muscles will be forced back to the core, and it will cause a decrease in that core temperature again, causing an after drop effect where you're bringing in cold blood into the core again, and the core of the body decreases in its temperature. So, warming the extremities might not be a bad idea, as I'm sure most of you know. Fever. All right. I think I'm going to make 2 tapes. So I'm going to pause the tape here and restart it, and I will see you in the next video.